All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Charlotte, a 38-year-old loan officer from Pennsylvania. Sharing this is hard, but I need to process how my husband William's infidelity with a female neighbor shattered our 12-year marriage. It began when at a neighbor's birthday party, I noticed he'd hit his phone the moment a specific song started to play, a stupid pop song from a decade ago I never liked, but he did it with a furtive, guilty jerk of his shoulder, a movement so small and yet so violently out of place it felt like a seismic crack appearing in the floor beneath my feet. The phone, a black slab of glass and secrets, was shoved deep into his front pants pocket as if he could physically silence it, hide it from the opening chords of that song. I didn't know what I knew, not yet, not in any concrete way that I could have articulated to the smiling people around me holding their paper plates of grilled chicken and potato salad, but the knowing was a cold, heavy stone that dropped straight into the pit of my stomach, extinguishing all the warmth from the late afternoon sun. The party was at the Miller's house, 3 doors down. Bill and Sarah Miller, with their perfectly manicured lawn and their hyperactive golden retriever that always jumped the fence. William had been oddly eager to go, which was strange because he usually grumbled about suburban obligations, about making small talk over coolers of cheap beer. That day he'd suggested we bring the good craft IPA, the one he usually hoarded for himself. He put on a new shirt, a crisp blue checkered one I didn't remember buying for him. Small things, pebbles. I didn't think to add them up until later, when the sum total of them would crush the breath from my lungs. We were there, standing by the fence line where the perfectly green grass met the flower beds. Sarah was laughing at something, her head thrown back. Bill was manning the grill, a comically large apron tied around his waist. The music was playing from a Bluetooth speaker perched on their porch steps, a generic summer playlist. And then that song came on. It was a song I associated with bad car rides and grocery store aisles, utterly unremarkable. But William's entire body went rigid for a fraction of a second. His smile, which had been easy and relaxed, froze into a grimace. His hand dove into his pocket, and the phone disappeared. He didn't look at it. He just hid it, as if the song itself were a signal, a trigger for a clandestine operation he needed to shut down immediately. My own smile felt plastered on my face. "You okay?" I asked, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, like someone else was speaking my lines in a play I hadn't rehearsed for. Yeah, fine, just a phantom vibration." He pulled his hand out of his pocket and reached for his beer, taking a long swallow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking over my shoulder, towards the Miller's back door. I followed his gaze. Megan, the neighbor from across the street, was coming out, holding a bowl of something. Potato salad, maybe. She was laughing, saying something to someone behind her. She was pretty in a way I'd never really stopped to consider before. Long, sun-streaked brown hair, a easy athletic grace. She waved at our little group, her eyes scanning us, landing on William for a heartbeat too long before flicking away. A casual, neighborly wave. Nothing more, but the cold stone in my stomach grew colder. The pebbles began to add up. The petals began to add up. The new shirt. The eagerness to come. The way he'd been taking the trash out more often lately, trips that seemed to take an awfully long time. The way he sometimes stood at the living room window in the evenings, just looking out. I'd thought he was just decompressing from work. Now, a new, horrifying picture was developing in the darkroom of my mind, and I was watching it appear, detail by awful detail. I spent the rest of the party in a bubble of numb observation. I watched him. I watched her. They didn't speak directly. They didn't stand near each other. They were careful. Too careful. Too careful. It was the absence of interaction that became the most damning evidence. In a small, crowded party, it's impossible to avoid someone completely unless you are actively, consciously trying to. Their orbits were deliberately kept apart. A silent agreement made long before this afternoon. I felt like an anthropologist studying a strange new species, noting the rituals, the avoidance dances, the subtle signs of a shared secret. The ride home was quiet, and probably was asking. The sun had set, and the interior of the car was dark. William drove, one hand on the wheel, the other tapping a rhythm on his leg. He seemed relieved, the party behind him. The secret, for now, still safe. "That was fun," he said, his voice too bright for the dim car. "The Millers know how to throw a party." I responded, a non-committal sound. I stared out the window at the passing houses, each one a lit box containing its own universe of secrets and joys and sorrows. My own box had just fractured. "You're quiet," he said after a few blocks. "Just tired." It wasn't a lie. I was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that goes straight to the bone, a weariness born from the energy it takes to hold a smiling mask in place while your internal world is collapsing. We got home. Our home. The house we'd bought 5 years ago, the one we'd painted together, the one where we'd planned a future that suddenly felt like a lie constructed of drywall and memories. He went to take a shower. I stood in the kitchen, my hand resting on the cool granite of the countertop we'd chosen together after weeks of debate. This was my life. This was my marriage. 12 years. It felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly fragile, like a piece of glass that could shatter from a single, wrong note of a stupid pop song. His phone was on the counter. He'd taken it out of his pocket when we came in and left it there, face down. It was a silent, black obelisk in the soft glow of the under-cabinet lighting. I looked at it. The cold stone in my stomach was now a glacier, spreading through my veins. I knew I shouldn't. I knew that looking was the point of no return. If I looked, the life I knew would be over, but the life I knew was already over, wasn't it? It had ended at that party, with a furtive movement and a hidden phone. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I picked it up. It was warm from his body heat. I pressed his thumb to the sensor. We had each other's fingerprints registered, a gesture of trust and shared life that now felt like the ultimate betrayal. The screen glowed to life. I didn't know what I was looking for. Texts? Photos? I went to his messages. Nothing obvious. Nothing to Megan. His email was clean. I was about to put it down, to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the chill in my soul was just indigestion from potato salad, when I saw it. The music app, he'd been listening to that song. Not just listening, it was on a playlist he'd created. A playlist named M, and it was full of songs I'd never heard him play before. Sentimental ballads. Upbeat pop tunes. The kind of music you listen to when you're falling in love, or pretending to. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound, and I scrolled through the list of songs on that playlist. Each title was a little dagger. And then I saw the last played time for that specific song. This afternoon, 41:17 p.m. Right around the time he'd hidden his phone at the party. It wasn't proof. Not really. It was circumstantial. A playlist and a coincidence. But in the economy of a marriage, of a shared life, it was all the proof I needed. The currency of trust had been devalued to nothing. I placed the phone back on the counter, exactly as I found it, face down. I walked calmly to the living room and sat down in my armchair, the one by the window where I liked to read. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for him to finish his shower. I waited for the man I loved, the man I had built 12 years with, to come out and look me in the eye. I sat there, perfectly still, while the foundation of everything I was cracked wide open and a new, terrifying reality began to pour in. The sound of the shower shutting off was a gunshot in the silence of the house. I didn't move from the chair. My hands remained folded in my lap, my posture unnaturally straight, as if any slackening of my muscles would cause me to completely unravel. I heard the bathroom door open, the sigh of steam escaping into the hallway, the soft pad of his bare feet on the hardwood floor. He was heading towards the kitchen, probably for a glass of water. I heard the fridge door open and close. Then his footsteps paused. He'd seen his phone, right where he left it. I could picture him picking it up, checking the screen, assuring himself his secret world was still intact. His footsteps started again, coming towards the living room. He appeared in the doorway, a towel slung around his hips, another in his hand rubbing at his damp hair. He smelled of soap and steam, a clean, familiar scent that now felt like a costume. "You just sitting in the dark?" he asked, his voice light, oblivious. He flicked on a lamp, and a soft pool of light pushed back the shadows in the room, but it couldn't touch the one growing inside me. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. I looked at the man I had loved for 12 years. the man whose face I knew better than my own, and I tried to see the stranger living behind his eyes. He dropped the towel from his head onto the back of the sofa. "What's up? You've been weird since the party," he said it with a slight smile, a hint of annoyance edging his tone. The normalcy of it, the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his normalcy, was what finally broke my silence. "What's the playlist for, William?" The words came out flat, devoid of the tremor I felt in my soul. They hung in the air between us, simple and devastating. His smile didn't vanish immediately. It froze, then slowly melted into an expression of confused curiosity. "A perfect performance. Playlist? What playlist? What playlist? I've got a bunch of them. The workout one, the driving one, the one called M," I said, my voice still that terrible calm monotone, "the one you were listening to today." At 41:17 p.m., I saw it then. The flicker. A microscopic dilation of his pupils, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth, a fault line appearing in his composure. He recovered quickly, shrugging as he walked over to the armchair opposite me and sat down. "Oh, that. It's nothing. Just some random songs I threw together. Didn't know you were monitoring my listening habits?" He tried to make it a joke, a gentle tease to deflect. "You hid your phone when that song came on," I continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "At the party. You shoved it in your pocket like it was on fire. Why?" His face was beginning to flush, a red tide creeping up from his neck. Annoyance was winning out over feigned confusion. "Charlotte, what is this?" "I don't know. It was loud. I didn't want it to buzz or something. It was a reflex." "You're being paranoid." "Paranoid," I repeated, tasting the word. "It was what they always said, wasn't it? In the movies, in the stories. The guilty party calls the betrayed paranoid. It's the first line of defense." "Who is M, William?" "It's not a who, it's a what," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's for mellow, yeah. It's a mellow playlist. For relaxing." He was a terrible liar. We'd been together 12 years, and in all that time, he'd never been able to lie to me effectively. His tells were my second language, the way he couldn't hold eye contact, the way his right thumb rubbed against his forefinger, the slight over-explanation. He was doing all of it now. "Mellow," I said, and for the first time a sliver of emotion leaked into my voice, a sharp, icy sliver of disdain. "You created a playlist called Mellows, full of pop love songs, and hid your phone when one of them played at a party where Megan from across the street was also in attendance. Is that the sequence of events? Do I have the details right?" The mention of her name was the kill shot. The color drained from his face, then flooded back, dark and angry. The mask fell away completely, replaced by a defensive, cornered anger. "Don't you bring her into this. This is between you and me and your crazy suspicions." "This is exactly why he stopped himself, but it was too late. "Why you, what?" The ice in my voice was spreading, freezing me from the inside out, keeping me terrifyingly calm. "Why you need someone to talk to. Why you need a mellow playlist with the neighbor. What is it, William? What is it that I do that makes you seek her out?" He stood up abruptly, pacing in front of the fireplace. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. So what if I have a playlist? So what if I talk to Megan? She's nice, she's easy to talk to. She doesn't interrogate me over every little thing," and there it was. The classic script. She's easy to talk to. You don't understand me. You're too demanding. The clichés were like body blows, each one more painful in its unoriginality. Our unique 12-year love story was ending not with a unique, tragic flourish, but with the most hackneyed, predictable dialogue imaginable. "What have you talked to her about, William?" My voice was a whisper now, but it cut through the room like a blade. "What parts of our life, of our marriage, have you offered up to her for easy conversation?" He stopped pacing and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of utter frustration. "It's not like that. We just talk about work, like about the neighborhood, about nothing important." "Then why does it require secrecy?" I asked. "Why the hidden phone? Why the playlist? If it's nothing, why does it feel like everything?" He had no answer for that. He just stood there, breathing heavily, looking at me like I was the one who had betrayed him, like I was the unreasonable monster shattering our peaceful evening. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. It's not an affair, he finally said, his voice quieter, defeated. It's not physical. I swear to you, Charlotte, it's not physical. The qualification should have offered a shred of comfort. It did the opposite. It was the confirmation of everything. The emotional affair. The intimacy given to someone else. The sharing of thoughts and time and music. In some ways, it felt like a deeper, more profound betrayal than a purely physical one. He had given her a part of his mind, a part of his attention, that belonged to me, to us. You swear, I said, the words hollow. You swear it's not physical. That's what you're clinging to? That's the hill you're choosing to die on? The technicality of whether or not you've slept with her? I finally moved, unfolding my hands and placing them on the arms of the chair, pushing myself to stand. My legs felt weak, but I held myself straight. The betrayal isn't in the physical act, William. The betrayal is in the secrecy. It's in the playlist. It's in the hidden phone. It's in you standing here, lying to my face. You have been unfaithful. In every way that matters to me, you have been unfaithful. Tears were in his eyes now. Charlotte, please, it was a mistake. It was stupid. It didn't mean anything. It meant something to me, I said, my voice breaking for the first time. Our marriage meant something to me. Apparently, it meant less to you than a few easy conversations with a woman who doesn't interrogate you. I walked past him, towards the hallway that led to our bedroom. I couldn't look at him anymore. The sight of his tears, his regret, it made me sick. It was too little, too late. The foundation was dust. Where are you going? He asked, his voice pleading. To the guest room, I said without turning around. I want you to leave in the morning. I want you to go stay somewhere else. You're throwing me out? Over this? Over nothing? I stopped at the mouth of the hallway and finally turned to look at him one last time. The man I loved was gone. In his place was a pathetic stranger begging for clemency for a crime he wouldn't even fully admit to committing. You didn't protect us, William, I said, my voice barely audible. You didn't protect what we had. You didn't value it. So yes, I want you to leave. This isn't nothing. This is the end of everything. I turned and walked down the hall, closing the guest room door behind me. I didn't lock it. I just leaned against it, sliding down to the floor as the first sob, silent and wrenching, finally tore its way out of my throat. I cried for the us that was, for the us that would never be, for the 12 years that now felt like a beautiful, well-furnished lie. And outside the door, I heard him sink onto the sofa and begin to cry too. We cried separately, in different rooms, the chasm between us already too wide to ever cross again. The fallout had begun, and the air in our home would be poisoned with it for a very, very long time. The morning after the confrontation was a study in surreal, brutal practicality. The world outside the guest room window had the audacity to be sunny. Birds chirped with a relentless, cheerful ignorance. The clock on the nightstand read 7:32 a.m. Life, in its cruel, indifferent way, was simply continuing. My own life, however, had been cleaved in two, and now came the grim, administrative task of sorting through the pieces. I had not slept. I had sat on the floor, my back against the door, until the gray light of dawn seeped under the crack. The house had been silent for hours after William's crying subsided. Now, I could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the clink of a coffee mug, the sigh of the refrigerator door, the sounds of a normal morning in a home that was no longer normal. I stood up, my body aching with a fatigue that was more emotional than physical. I opened the door, the hallway seemed longer, foreign. He was standing by the sink, staring out the window, a full coffee mug steaming in his hand. He was already dressed for work in chinos and a polo shirt, his hair damp from a shower. The normalcy of his routine felt like a fresh betrayal. He turned when he heard me. His eyes were red-rimmed, puffy. He looked older. Charlotte, he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't respond. I walked past him, went to the coffee machine, and made my own cup. I needed the caffeine, the routine, the anger of a simple, familiar action. The silence between us was thick and heavy, charged with all the words that had been said, and all the words that were now useless. I called Mark, he said finally, referring to his older brother who lived an hour away. I'm going to stay with him for a while. I nodded, staring into the dark swirl of my coffee. Okay, we should. We need to talk about things. I looked up at him then. What is there to talk about, William? You made your choices. Now we manage the consequences. It's not a discussion. It's a division. He flinched at the word. It doesn't have to be ugly. A hollow, mirthless sound escaped my lips. It wasn't a laugh. It already is ugly. The moment you created that playlist, it became ugly. We're just now getting to the part where we have to clean it up. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted like ash. I'll contact a lawyer today. You should do the same. The formality of it was a shield. Lawyer. The word made it real, final. It transformed a broken heart into a case file, a shattered trust into a list of assets to be partitioned. He looked down at his feet. I don't want to fight over stuff, Charlotte. The house, the cars, you can have whatever you want. It's not about stuff, I said, my voice low and tight. It's about equity. It's about 12 years of my life. It's about the fact that I put my career on hold for 2 years so you could get your MBA. It's about the fact that my salary paid the mortgage while you were building your client base. This isn't generosity, William. This is math. And it's the law. I was surprising myself with my own cold clarity. The grief was there, a vast, dark ocean beneath me, but on the surface, I was all ice. It was the only way to keep from drowning. He was silent, chastened. He had expected tears, begging, perhaps a dramatic scene. He had not expected this calm, pragmatic executioner. I'll pack a bag, he said quietly. Take what you need, but don't take anything that's jointly owned without discussing it. The lawyer will want an inventory. He left the kitchen, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heading to the bedroom, our bedroom. I stayed put, listening to the sounds of him moving around upstairs, opening drawers, closing closets. Each sound was a tiny amputation. This was the beginning of the uncoupling. The physical disentanglement of two lives woven together for over a decade. He came back down 20 minutes later, carrying a duffel bag and a suit garment bag. He looked like a businessman heading out on a trip, not like a man leaving his home for the last time. He paused in the doorway to the kitchen. I'm sorry, Charlotte. I am so sorry. The apology hung in the air between us. It was probably genuine, but it was also worthless. It couldn't unbreak what was broken. It was a sentiment, and we were now in the realm of cold, hard facts. You should go, I said, not looking at him. You'll be late for work. I heard him take a breath, as if to say something else, then think better of it. A moment later, the front door opened and closed. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard. I was alone. The silence of the house was immediately oppressive. It was a living thing, heavy and accusing. I walked from room to room, a ghost in my own home. The living room, where we'd watched 1,000 movies. The dining room, where we'd hosted holidays. The bedroom. I stood in the doorway, looking at the bed. His side was messy, the duvet thrown back. On his nightstand was a book he was reading, a half-empty glass of water. It looked like he'd just stepped out. It looked like he was coming back, but he wasn't. The first wave of true, unadulterated panic hit me then. It rose in my chest, a cold, sharp terror. What was I doing? What was I going to do? My entire adult life had been built in a duo. Every plan, every dream, every mundane Sunday morning routine involved him. I didn't know how to be just me anymore. The me I was had been part of an us for so long. I stumbled back downstairs, my heart hammering. I needed a task, something concrete, something to keep the panic at bay. I went into the home office, a small room we shared. His desk was on one side, mine on the other. I sat down at my computer, the ice of pragmatism reforming over the panic. I Googled divorce attorneys, my town, Pennsylvania. A list of names and firm websites popped up. It felt like looking up restaurants or plumbers. I was comparing reviews for the person who would help me formally end my marriage. I made 3 calls. The first 2 couldn't see me for a week. The third, a woman named Evelyn Ross with a calm, no-nonsense voice, had a cancellation that afternoon. I took the appointment. Then I did the next thing. I opened a spreadsheet. I titled it Division of Assets. I began listing everything. The house, its approximate value, the remaining mortgage, my car, his car, our joint savings account, his 401k, my IRA, the checking account. I listed every object that felt significant. The wedding china we never used, the good silverware, the painting we bought on our honeymoon, the TV, the sofa. It was horrifying. It was reducing a marriage, a life, to an inventory list. It was the ultimate act of desecration. But it was also necessary. It was my life raft. Each cell I filled, each number I entered, was a step away from the emotional abyss and a step into a new, terrifying reality where I was alone, but I was in control. The lawyer's office that afternoon was all soft carpets and muted tones, a place designed to take the edge off of life's sharpest tragedies. Evelyn Ross was in her 50s, with intelligent eyes and a demeanor that was both empathetic and brutally efficient. "Tell me what happened," she said after the preliminaries. I told her. I kept my voice steady, clinical. I told her about the party, the phone, the playlist, his admission of an emotional affair with the neighbor. I did not cry. I presented the facts as if I were in a meeting at the bank discussing a loan application. She listened, nodding occasionally, taking notes. When I finished, she set her pen down. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said, and it sounded genuine, not just professional courtesy. Pennsylvania is a no-fault state, but evidence of infidelity can sometimes influence alimony or the division of assets, so what you've told me is relevant. Do you have proof of the playlist? Screenshots? I nodded. I had taken them that morning, my hands trembling as I captured the evidence of my own life's destruction on his phone before he left. Good. Now, let's talk about your immediate concerns. The house. And so we began. The division had moved from my kitchen to a professional office. It was no longer just emotional, it was legal, financial, binding. We talked about temporary spousal support, about who would stay in the house. I told her I wanted to stay. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving on top of everything else. She advised me to change the locks. I left her office 2 hours later with a stack of paperwork and a list of tasks. A temporary separation agreement needed to be drafted. Financial disclosures needed to be prepared. It was a mountain of administrative agony. When I got home, the first thing I did was call a locksmith. Then I went back to the spreadsheet. I was dividing a life. And with every painful entry, I was building a new one, piece by fractured piece, from the ruins of the old. The silence after the locksmith left was a different kind of silence. It was a sanctioned silence, a barricaded silence. The new locks on the doors were cold, metallic facts. They said, "You are in. He is out." They were a boundary drawn in steel, and I was on one side of it, completely and utterly alone. For the first few days, the pragmatism that had carried me through the division held. I went to work. I spoke to Evelyn Ross, my lawyer, on the phone. I ate meals because my body demanded fuel, not because I had any appetite. I was a ghost going through the motions of a life that no longer fit. I was managing, or so I told myself. But the silence of the house was a patient predator. It waited, and on the fourth night, it pounced. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea I didn't want. The house was dark except for the under-cabinet lighting. It was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator was a monotonous drone, and my own breathing sounded too loud. I reached for a mug from the cupboard, a stupid, cheerful mug with a cartoon cactus on it that said, "Prickly but sweet." William had bought it for me as a joke on a trip to Arizona. My hand closed around the handle, and a memory ambushed me. Us, laughing in a rental car, the desert sun blazing, him pointing to the mug in a gift shop window and saying, "That's you in the morning before coffee." The memory was so vivid, so warm, it was a physical blow. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the tile floor. The sound was catastrophically loud in the silent house. I stared at the pieces of ceramic, the cheerful cactus, now a dozen broken fragments. It was our marriage. It was my life, a stupid, broken thing on the floor. I didn't clean it up. I just stood there staring, and the dam inside me, the one I had built with spreadsheets and lawyer appointments and new locks, finally burst. It wasn't a graceful crying. It was a raw, ugly animal thing. Sobs racked my body so hard I had to grip the countertop to stay upright. The tears were hot and endless. I cried for the broken mug. I cried for the desert sun. I cried for the man who had bought it for me, the man who was gone, the man who had chosen a playlist named M over 12 years of inside jokes and shared sunsets. I cried until my throat was raw and my head throbbed. The grief was a riptide, pulling me under. The pragmatic ice was gone, melted in this sudden, scorching flood of pure pain. I was drowning in it. I slid down the cabinet onto the floor, right next to the shattered pieces of the mug. I drew my knees to my chest and buried my face in my arms, wanting to disappear, to be swallowed by the cool tile. What was the point? The question echoed in the hollowed-out cavern of my mind. What was the point of any of it? The house was just a structure of wood and plaster. My job was a series of meaningless tasks to approve or deny loans for strangers. My future was a vast, empty plain stretching out in front of me, devoid of landmarks, devoid of love, devoid of purpose. The weight of it was crushing. This was the nadir, the absolute bottom. The place where all the light was gone. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had lost all meaning. But eventually, the storm of sobs subsided into a numb, hiccuping exhaustion. I lifted my head. My eyes were swollen, my face wet and sticky. The world was blurry, and I saw myself. It was a reflection. A distorted, warped reflection in the curved stainless steel front of the 2-slot toaster that sat on the counter across from me. My face was elongated, my features blurred and merged by the metal's imperfect surface. I looked like a ghost. A funhouse mirror version of the woman I used to be. I stared at this strange, watery reflection. The silence pressed in again, but it was different now. It was waiting. The reflection stared back, a silent, distorted companion in my misery. And then, I spoke to it. My voice was a ragged, broken thing, alien to my own ears. "Who are you?" I whispered to the toaster reflection. It didn't answer, of course. It just stared. A sad, elongated face in the metal. "What are you going to do?" I asked it, my voice a little stronger, hoarse from crying. The reflection seemed to consider this. The distorted version of me. The version that was left after the subtraction of William, of us. "You're alone," I told the reflection, stating the stark, terrifying fact. The reflection nodded back in its warped way, agreeing. The absurdity of it should have snapped me out of it. Talking to my own reflection in a kitchen appliance. It was the behavior of someone who had truly lost it. But in that moment, it felt perfectly logical. And in sea opening. It was the most honest conversation I'd had in weeks. There was no one to lie to, no one to perform for. It was just me and the raw, unfiltered truth, reflected back at me in a piece of polished steel. "He's not coming back," I said. And the words, spoken aloud to my silent listener, finally landed with their full, devastating weight. They weren't a question anymore. They were a fact, as cold and hard as the new locks on the door. The reflection absorbed this. We sat in silence for a while, me on the floor, her in the toaster. "You're still here," I said finally. The reflection was still there. Blurred, distorted, broken, but present. The thought was so simple, so obvious, yet it was a revelation. I was still here. The world had ended, but I was still breathing. My heart was still beating, even though it felt like a shattered thing in my chest. I had hit the bottom, and the bottom was a cold kitchen floor next to a broken mug, and I was still here. I wasn't okay. I was far, far from okay. But I was present. I existed independently of him, of the marriage, of the life that was gone. The identity of William's wife had been incinerated, and what was left was this raw, fundamental creature on the floor. Charlotte, just Charlotte. A 38-year-old loan officer from Pennsylvania who was sitting in her own mess, talking to a toaster. A sound came out of me then. It was a choked, wet sound, halfway between a sob and a laugh. The absurdity finally broke through the despair. I was having a pivotal life moment with a small kitchen appliance. It was tragic. It was hilarious. It was so profoundly, humanly pathetic that it somehow looped back around to being something else. Something like the very first, faint stirring of acceptance. I wasn't going to get up and dance. I wasn't suddenly filled with hope. The grief was still a boulder on my chest. But the absolute suffocating darkness of the nadir had, not lifted, but perhaps thinned by a fraction. A pinprick of light? No, not even light, just the faintest sense that the darkness itself was a place I could inhabit for a while, that I could sit in it, and it wouldn't actually kill me. Slowly, stiffly, I pushed myself up from the floor. My body ached. I found the dustpan and brush and swept up the pieces of the cactus mug. I didn't do it with any sense of ceremony or metaphor. I did it because it was broken, and broken glass on the floor is a hazard. It was a practical step. But as I tipped the shards into the trash, I acknowledged it. I was cleaning up a mess. It was a small, stupid mess, but it was a start. I avoided looking at the toaster. I felt a strange sense of embarrassment, as if I'd been caught in a vulnerable moment by an inanimate object. I made my tea in a plain white mug, drank it standing at the counter, and went upstairs to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, in the bed that was now too big, and I stared at the ceiling. The conversation with the toaster reflection played in my mind. It hadn't offered any answers. It had only echoed my own questions back at me. But in the echoing, in the hearing of my own voice stating the bleak facts aloud, something had shifted. The terror of the empty future was still there, but it was now accompanied by a tiny, stubborn spark of curiosity. A horrifying, unwelcome curiosity. Who was I, now that I was no longer we? The question was no longer a cry of despair. It was, for the very first time, just a question. And questions, no matter how daunting, imply that there is an answer to be found somewhere, later. The nadir wasn't an end. It was a foundation. A cold, hard, barren foundation made of broken pottery and silent appliances. But it was something to build on. Nothing would ever be built on the beautiful, furnished lie again. It had to be built on the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to understand, was that I was alone, I was sad, I was talking to toasters, and I was still here. The days after the nadir were gray and soft at the edges, like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The sharp, stabbing pain had receded, leaving behind a dull, pervasive ache. I moved through the house, through my life, with a newfound numbness. The conversation with the toaster reflection hadn't solved anything, but it had carved out a small, quiet space inside me where the truth could reside without immediately triggering a panic attack. He is gone. You are here. It was a mantra of stark fact, not of comfort. The silence was still there, but I was learning its geography. The creak of the floorboard near the fireplace at 3 p.m. when the sun hit it just right. The specific hum the refrigerator made just before the compressor kicked in. The way the wind whistled through the slightly loose pane in the bedroom window. These were the sounds of my life now. My solo. The lawyer calls continued. Emails with financial documents. A formal separation agreement arrived via certified mail. William signed it without contest, a fact that felt less like generosity and more like a final admission of guilt. The machinery of uncoupling was grinding forward, and I was a cog in it, numb and compliant. It was during one of these calls with Evelyn Ross, as I sat at my desk staring blankly at a spreadsheet of our former joint life, that she said something that wasn't on the legal script. "Charlotte," she said, her voice softening from its professional cadence. "This is the hardest part. The administrative purgatory. It's important, but it's draining. Are you taking any time for yourself? Doing anything that's just for you?" I was silent for a moment, my eyes tracing the lines of the wood grain on my desk. "I go to work," I said finally, my voice flat. "I come home. I deal with this. That's not what I mean," she replied, not unkindly. "I mean something that has nothing to do with him, or the divorce, or the life you had. Something new, something that is just yours. It doesn't have to be big. It just has to be a thing you choose to do." After I hung up, her words echoed in the quiet office. Something that is just yours. The concept felt alien, like trying to recall a language I'd spoken in a childhood dream. What did I like? What did I want? For 12 years, my wants had been filtered through the lens of us. I wanted the house with the bigger garden because we loved to grill outside. I wanted to vacation in Maine because we loved lobster. My identity had been a hyphenate, Charlotte and William. Now, there was no hyphen. There was just Charlotte. And Charlotte was a void. Later that afternoon, aimlessly scrolling through my phone to avoid the silence, I saw an ad. It was for the community center a few towns over. A grid of activities. Zumba, pottery, digital photography. And then, my finger stopped scrolling. Adult beginner swim lessons. Mondays and Wednesdays, 7 p.m. I stared at the words. Swimming. I didn't know how to swim. It was one of those things. As a kid, we never had a pool or went to the beach. As an adult, it never seemed necessary. William was a strong swimmer. He'd always joked he'd be my personal lifeguard, but we never actually went anywhere that required it. It was a small, quiet lack in my life I'd never bothered to fill. Something that is just yours. It was a ridiculous thought. Me, a 38-year-old woman, putting on a swimsuit and getting in a pool with a bunch of strangers to learn how to not drown. The humiliation of it prickled at my skin. But beneath the humiliation was something else. A tiny, stubborn flicker. It was a thing he had never done. It was a thing that had no connection to him, to us, to the past. It was a skill, a practical, physical thing. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't a support group. It was just swimming. The decision wasn't a grand, empowering moment. It was a surrender to desperation. I was so tired of the gray, of the ache, of the spreadsheets and the silence. I needed to do something, anything, that wasn't about looking backward. I needed to move my body through space in a new way. So, before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked the link and registered. I typed in my credit card number, my card from my account, the one I'd opened last week, and hit confirm. The following Monday, standing in the locker room of the community center, I was certain I had made a catastrophic mistake. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine and damp concrete. The sounds were echoes of shouts and splashing from the pool deck, magnified and distorted by the tiled walls. Women of all ages and shapes moved around me with an easy familiarity, pulling on caps, adjusting goggles. I felt like an imposter, an awkward, pale ghost in a too new, too bright blue swimsuit. I clutched my own bag, containing a towel, goggles, and a swim cap I had no idea how to put on. My hands were shaking. This was stupid. This was the most pathetic thing I had ever done. I could just leave. No one would know. First time, I jumped. A woman about my age with kind eyes and a friendly smile was tying her hair into a bun. She nodded toward my death grip on the bag. I nodded, unable to form words. Don't worry, she said. Janice, the instructor, is great. She's used to terrified adults. You're in the 7 o'clock with her, right? You'll be fine. Just remember, everyone here is focused on themselves. No one's watching you. Her words were simple, but they were a lifeline. She smiled again and headed out to the deck. I took a deep breath, the chlorine burning my lungs. No one's watching you. It was the opposite of my entire life for the past month, where I felt like every move was being scrutinized, by William, by the lawyers, by my own critical inner eye. Here, I was anonymous. Just another body learning a new thing. I fumbled the swim cap onto my head, my hair protesting underneath it. I put on the goggles. The world shrank to a blurry, framed view. I walked out onto the pool deck. The noise was immense. The crash of water, the instructor's whistle, the laughter. The pool was a chaotic, bright blue expanse under the harsh fluorescent lights. Janice, a wiry woman in her 60s with a whistle around her neck and a no-nonsense demeanor, waved our small group over to the shallow end. "Polite newcomers. Welcome to the water," she said, her voice cutting through the din. "Forget everything you think you know. We start from scratch. The water is not your enemy. It's just water. Your job is to learn to work with it. We started not by swimming, but by standing in the water, chest deep, getting used to the buoyancy, the resistance. We held onto the edge and practiced kicking. Simple, childish things. I felt foolish, my legs moving in clumsy, uncoordinated flaps. But Janice moved among us, offering small corrections. Point your toes like a ballerina, not like you're stomping a spider. It's not about power, it's about rhythm. And then came the moment I'd been dreading. Putting my face in the water. Breathing out. Bubbles. I stood there, gripping the gutter, staring down into the rippling, chemical blue depths. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was such a simple act. But it felt like the most vulnerable, terrifying thing I had done since sitting on my kitchen floor. It was an act of trust. Trust in the water? Trust in myself? I didn't know. Just try it, Janice said, her voice calm beside me. 1 second. blow out your nose. It's just air. I took a ragged breath, squeezed my eyes shut behind the goggles, and plunged my face into the water. The world vanished. The noise of the pool became a distant, muffled roar. All that existed was the cold shock of water on my skin and the sound of my own frantic bubbles escaping from my nose. I pushed them out, a stream of silver air rising in front, my blurred vision. 1 second. 2. I jerked my head back out, gasping, water streaming down my face. "There," Janice said, as if I'd just scaled a mountain. "You did it. How did it feel?" "Terrifying," I choked out, wiping water from my eyes. She laughed. "Good, it's supposed to be. That's the point. You did a terrifying thing and you're still here. Now, do it again," and I did. Again and again. Each time, the terror receded by a fraction. Each time, the world underwater felt a little less alien. I wasn't swimming. Not really. I was just putting my face in the water and blowing bubbles. But it was a start. It was a first trembling step. For that hour, I didn't think about William. I didn't think about the divorce. I didn't think about the empty house. I thought about my breath. I thought about my toes. I thought about the feeling of water flowing over my arms. I was wholly, completely, physically present in my body, in a way I hadn't been since the world fell apart. It was exhausting. It was humbling. But as I walked out of the community center later, my hair wet, my skin smelling sharply of chlorine, my muscles aching with a new and different fatigue, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't joy. It was the simple, profound satisfaction of having done a hard thing. I had chosen something. I had shown up. I had been terrified, and I had done it anyway. The water hadn't healed me. It hadn't fixed anything. But for 1 hour, it had held me. And I had, for a few seconds at a time, trusted it to. It was a small thing. A ridiculously small thing. But it was mine. And as I got into my car, the scent of chlorine clinging to me like a promise, I knew it was the first step. Not on a path to a new life, but on the path to finding the woman who might one day be able to build one. The chlorine smell became my new perfume. It lingered on my skin, a sharp, chemical testament to the thing I was doing just for me. Monday and Wednesday evenings became immutable blocks in my calendar, sacred and non-negotiable. The world could be ending, and some days, it still felt like it was, but at 7 p.m. on those nights, I was in the water. The early struggles were humiliating and exhausting. My body, a thing I had largely ignored for years except as a vessel for carrying my head from meeting to meeting, suddenly announced its presence with a symphony of complaints. Muscles I never knew existed screamed in protest after each lesson. My lungs burned from the controlled, frantic gasping that passed for breathing. I was perpetually waterlogged, my ears feeling full, my sinuses stinging from the constant invasion of pool water. I wasn't a natural. Coordination between arms and legs and breath was a complex dance I constantly stumbled through. I'd try to turn my head to breathe and instead get a mouthful of water, choking and spluttering while Janice blew her whistle and called, "Spit it out, Charlotte." "It's just water. Try again." The other beginners, a motley crew of two 20-somethings and a man in his 50s, seemed to progress faster. They graduated from holding the wall to using kickboards, then to swimming short, shaky widths of the pool. I remained stubbornly anchored to the gutter, my kicks still more spider stomp than ballerina point. The frustration was a live wire. There were moments, submerged in the chaotic roar of the pool, when I wanted to scream. I wanted to pound the water with my fists. Why couldn't I do this simple thing? Why was my body so stubbornly, stupidly refusing to learn? The feeling was a mirror of the larger frustration of my life. I was trying to move forward, but I kept swallowing water, kept being held back by my own ineptitude. But Janice was implacable. She had the patience of a glacier. "It's not a race," she'd say, her voice calm amid my sputtering. "Your body is learning a new language. It takes time. Stop fighting the water. You have to relax into it. Relax." It was the most impossible instruction. How could I relax when every instinct screamed that putting my face in water and trusting my breath to a precise turn of the head was a prelude to drowning? My life had taught me that relaxation was a luxury you couldn't afford. You had to be vigilant. You had to watch for the signs, the hidden phones, the slight changes in behavior. Vigilance had kept me safe. Now, I was being told the key to progress was to let that vigilance go, to surrender. It was on a Wednesday, during the third week, that the first small win happened. We were practicing the breaststroke. Arms pull, breathe in. Kick, head down, breathe out. It was a complicated sequence that left me floundering. I'd get the arms right and forget to kick. I'd remember to kick and forget to breathe. My movements were jerky, panicked. "Charlotte," Janice said, wading over to me, "you're trying to do it all at once. Stop. Just do the arms. Forget the kick, just arms and breath. Let your legs drag, they're just along for the ride." I looked at her like she was crazy. Let my legs drag? That wasn't swimming. That was sinking with style. But I was too tired to argue. I tried it. I focused solely on the slow, sweeping pull of my arms, the turn of my head to gasp a breath, the slow exhale into the water as my arms reached forward. My legs hung uselessly behind me. I wasn't going anywhere fast. But something was different. I wasn't fighting. I was just moving. The rhythm, however slow, was smoother. I wasn't choking. I completed one full cycle. Then another. I reached the wall and looked up, expecting a critique. Janice was nodding, a small smile on her face. "There, you see? You found the rhythm. Now, next time, we'll remind the legs they have a jog to do." It was nothing. A tiny thing. I hadn't swum a lap. I hadn't mastered a stroke. But I had found a moment of rhythm in the chaos. I had surrendered a piece of the fight, and the water had held me. A small, warm ember of accomplishment glowed in my chest. It was the first one I'd felt in months that wasn't tied to successfully navigating a piece of legal paperwork. The small wins began to accumulate, not in a straight line, but in a messy, stuttering progression. The day I managed to swim a full width of the pool without stopping, my form atrocious but my breath continuous. The day I finally figured out how to tread water for 30 seconds without feeling like I was in a life or death battle. The day I jumped into the deep end for the first time, the panic rising and then receding as my own buoyancy, a thing I'd never trusted, kept me afloat. The montage wasn't just happening in the pool. It was happening in the quiet spaces in between. I started cooking for one, not just microwaving frozen meals, but actually following recipes. I put on music, my music, not the radio station we'd both liked, and chopped vegetables. I burned things. I oversalted things. But I was feeding myself. It was a small, domestic act of self-preservation. I went to a movie alone on a Saturday afternoon. The theater was mostly empty. I sat in the dark, eating popcorn that was just for me, and I cried at a stupid, sentimental part. No one was there to see, to ask if I was okay. I could just cry and then stop and keep watching the movie. It was a revelation. I bought a plant, a low-maintenance succulent from the grocery store. I put it on the windowsill in the kitchen where the broken mug had lain. It was a small, green, growing thing. My responsibility. I watered it. I made sure it got sun. It was a tiny commitment to a future, to the idea that I would be around to see it grow. The grief was still there. It would ambush me at odd moments. A song on the car radio. The smell of his cologne on a sweater I found at the back of the closet. The sight of a couple arguing playfully in the supermarket aisle. The pain would slice through me, sharp and fresh, a reminder that the healing was not linear, but the rhythm of the new life was starting to form. Work, swim, cook, sleep. The days began to have a shape, a structure that was mine alone. The silence in the house began to feel less like an absence and more like a space I was slowly, tentatively beginning to furnish with my own things, my own sounds, my own smells, which, increasingly, were chlorine and roasted vegetables and the faint, clean scent of my new laundry detergent. I was learning, in the water and out of it, the difference between being alone and being lonely. They weren't the same thing. Loneliness was a hollow ache. Being alone was just a state of being. It could be empty, or it could be spacious. It could be quiet. It could be, on rare and surprising occasions, peaceful. I wasn't happy. But I wasn't actively drowning in sorrow every moment of the day. I was treading water. And some days, just for a few moments, it felt less like a desperate struggle to stay afloat and more like I was simply suspended, held, looking up at the sky from a new and different angle. The montage was the daily, grinding, unglamorous work of building a life, one shaky, imperfect stroke at a time. The turning point, the moment the struggle began to transmute into something resembling rhythm, came not with a grand epiphany, but with the dull thud of a season changing. The vibrant, cruel green of summer surrendered to the brittle gold and fiery red of Pennsylvania fall. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the perpetual chlorine haze that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in my sinuses and hair. The world was moving on, and for the first time, I felt not left behind, but moving alongside it in my own parallel, quieter lane. The routine was no longer a desperate construct to keep the void at bay. It had hardened into the very architecture of my life. It had a weight, a substance. It was predictable, and in its predictability, I found a strange, solid comfort. Mondays and Wednesdays were swimming. This was the immovable center, the keystone of the week. The novelty of terror had worn off, replaced by a focused, almost meditative practice. I was no longer the most hopeless in the class. The 20-somethings had dropped out, their initial enthusiasm waning, and the 50-something man, Gary, and I had become the stalwarts, the ones Janice now watched with a critical, expectant eye. The lessons had evolved. And in ferment, we were past the gutter. We were in the deep end, literally and figuratively. We were working on endurance now, on stringing laps together. The focus was on form, on efficiency. "Stop fighting the water, Charlotte," Janice would call out, her voice echoing in the cavernous pool area. "You're not wrestling it. You're moving through it. It's a partnership." Partnership. The word would have once been a trigger, a little knife twist of memory. Now it was just a technical term. My partnership was with the water. It was a relationship with clear physical rules. If I was calm, if I was rhythmic, if I respected its properties, it supported me. If I panicked, if I fought, it would let me sink. It was brutally, beautifully honest. There was no subtext, no hidden playlists, no lies. I found myself craving its blunt truth. I could now swim a continuous, if slow, crawl for 10 laps. My breathing was a ragged but reliable gasp roll exhale. My arms cycled with a muscle memory that was beginning to feel less learned and more innate. The water was no longer an adversary, it was a medium. I was learning to exist within it, to propel myself through it. The victory was no longer in not drowning, it was in the clean slice of a hand entering the water, the powerful push of a kick, the feeling of my body, working as a single coordinated unit. It was a physical competence I had never known I could possess. Tuesdays and Thursdays became my domestic days. Evenings spent in the kitchen, a sanctuary of my own making. I had graduated from simple recipes to more complex ones. I put on a podcast, something historical, something completely engrossing and unrelated to my own life, and lose myself in the chopping of onions, the sizzle of garlic and oil, the patient simmer of a sauce. The kitchen, once the site of my lowest moment, was being reclaimed, one meal at a time. The smells that filled the house were mine, roasting vegetables, baking bread, fragrant curries. They were smells of patience and care, a stark contrast to the frozen pizzas and takeout containers of the immediate post-William era. The house itself was changing. It was a slow, almost imperceptible metamorphosis. I'd taken down a few paintings we'd chosen together, storing them in the basement and replacing them with large, framed botanical prints I found at a flea market. I'd moved the furniture around in the living room, creating a new flow that suited only me. It was no longer our house. It was becoming my home. It held my things, my smells, my routines. His presence was receding, not with a dramatic purge, but with the quiet, steady accumulation of my own life. Fridays were for silence. I would come home from work, ignore my phone, and do nothing of consequence. I'd read. I'd stare out the window at the gathering dusk. I'd simply sit with the quiet. The silence, once a predator, was now a companion. It was a space to let the week settle, to feel the accumulated fatigue in my muscles, the good, honest fatigue of physical effort, and to simply be. No performance, no expectations, just the slow, steady rhythm of my own breath. Weekends were for exploration, small, solo missions. I visited a museum an hour away and spent 2 hours in front of a single painting, no one tugging at my sleeve to move on. I went on drives, following back roads with no destination in mind, the windows down, the cool autumn air swirling through the car. I visited a farmer's market and bought a single, perfect pumpkin, which now sat on my front porch, a cheerful orange sentinel. All wed. The divorce proceedings continued, a dull, bureaucratic drone in the background. Emails from Evelyn Ross. Documents to sign. It was no longer a raw, open wound, it was a chronic condition, managed with periodic doses of paperwork. William had texted once, a bland, "Hope you're doing okay." I hadn't responded. There was nothing left to say. The connection was severed. The shared project of our life was closed. My energy was now invested in a new project. Me. There were still bad moments, of course. Waves of loneliness that would crash over me without warning. A Saturday night, watching a movie, I'd laugh at a joke and instinctively turn to share the laugh with someone who wasn't there. The emptiness of the other side of the bed was still a physical presence some nights. The grief was a ghost that still haunted the halls, but it was growing fainter, its visits less frequent, its hold less powerful. The real change was internal. It was a shift in my own perception. I was beginning to look in the mirror and see not a victim, not a discarded wife, but a woman who was capable. A woman who could learn a new skill at 38. A woman who could cook a decent meal from scratch. A woman who could sit in her own silence and not break. The confidence was a tiny seedling, but it was there, putting down roots in the soil of my new routine. It was during a Wednesday night swim that I felt it most acutely. The pool was particularly quiet. Gary wasn't there. It was just me and Janice. She had me working on my flip turn, a thing I'd thought was far beyond my capabilities. "It's about trust," Janice said, treading water beside me. "You have to trust that you'll push off the wall and come out the other side. It feels like you're turning yourself upside down into chaos, but it's just a different direction." I failed. Over and over. I'd approach the wall, chicken out at the last second, and awkwardly grab the gutter. I'd get water up my nose. I'd feel disoriented and silly. "Again," Janice said, her voice calm. "Always again. On what felt like the 20th attempt, I didn't think. I just swam." I reached the wall, took a final breath, tucked my chin, and let my hips lead my legs over my head. The world upended in a whirl of bubbles and roaring sound. For a heart-stopping second, I was completely lost, my body tumbling in a blue void. Then my feet found the wall and I pushed, hard, shooting back in the direction I'd come from. I broke the surface, gasping, my goggles askew. I hadn't done it gracefully. It was probably a mess. But I'd done it. I righted my goggles, treading water, my heart hammering with adrenaline. Janice was smiling. "See? You trusted it." I swam the rest of the lap, my strokes feeling powerful, sure. As I pulled myself out of the pool at the end of the session, my body heavy and spent, I felt a profound sense of peace. The routine had given me structure. The swimming had given me strength. But this small act of trust in the middle of chaos felt like something else entirely. It felt like a metaphor I was finally living. I had turned my life upside down. I had been lost in the roaring, disorienting void. And I had pushed off and come out the other side, still moving, still breathing. Walking to my car, the cold night air raising goosebumps on my chlorine-soaked skin, I realized I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. The routine wasn't a cage, it was a chrysalis. Inside its predictable, daily rhythms, something new was slowly, painfully, beautifully beginning to form. The transformation was not a sudden, cinematic metamorphosis. It was a slow accretion, a layering of small, hard-won changes that eventually reached a critical mass, altering the very gravity of my being. It was the accumulation of 100 laps swum, 100 meals cooked for one, 100 evenings spent in silence that was no longer empty but full of my own thoughts. The chrysalis of routine had done its work, and without my even realizing it, the woman inside had grown new wings. It announced itself first in the mirror one morning. I was brushing my teeth, my mind already ticking through the day's tasks, when my own reflection gave me pause. I leaned closer, searching for the familiar signs of grief and fatigue. They were there, in the faint lines at the corners of my eyes, a little deeper than they used to be. But they weren't the whole story anymore. My face seemed quieter. The permanent note of anxious inquiry that had lived between my brows for months had smoothed out. My eyes, which had so often looked glassy with unshed tears or wide with panic, now held a calmer, more direct gaze. There was a stillness there I didn't recognize. It was the face of someone who had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop because she'd already lived through the entire shoe store collapsing. And she was still standing. The second announcement came from my body. The softness that had been my constant companion, the physical manifestation of a comfortable, shared life, had been reshaped. It wasn't about weight loss, though my clothes did fit differently. It was about density. The muscles in my shoulders and back, forged by countless laps, now defined my silhouette. My arms, when I reached for a can on the top shelf, were corded with a strength that was purely functional, earned. I felt solid in a way I never had before. My body was no longer just a container for my grief or a relic of a past life. It was a tool, an instrument, capable and reliable. Dressing was no longer an act of covering up, but of armoring this new, competent self for the day. I found myself choosing simpler clothes, better fabrics, things that moved with me, that acknowledged the physicality of my existence. The most profound change, however, was in the silence. The house no longer felt like a monument to an absence. It felt like a canvas. The quiet was no longer something to be endured. It was a space I inhabited, and I was finally beginning to furnish it with a sense of self that was entirely my own. I'd play music, not as a distraction, but as a soundtrack. I'd dance a little in the kitchen while washing dishes, a silly, private movement that was pure, unobserved joy. The ghost of William's presence had been evicted, not by rage, but by the gentle, persistent force of my own daily life. His memory was now a photograph in a book I rarely opened, its emotional charge depleted. This new equilibrium was tested, as it always is, in the outside world. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a day for grocery shopping. The supermarket had once been a minefield of memories. The aisle where we'd debate brands of pasta sauce, the checkout line where he'd always grab a bar of dark chocolate. Now, it was just a place with a well-organized produce section. I was comparing avocados, my mind on the ingredients for a salad, when a voice cut through the muzak. "Charlotte?" I turned. It was Sarah Miller from the birthday party that now felt like a lifetime ago. She was pushing a cart laden with the evidence of a full, busy family life juice boxes, giant packs of chicken, a bag of soccer balls. She looked exactly the same. "Sarah, hi," I said, my voice even. I felt a flicker of the old anxiety, the instinct to flinch, but it was faint, a distant echo. "Oh my God, it is you," she said, her eyes doing a quick, involuntary scan of me, taking in the changes. "How are you? We never see you around the neighborhood anymore." "I'm well," I said, and the astonishing thing was, in that moment, it was true. I wasn't just reciting a line, just keeping busy. There was an awkward pause. The unspoken thing hung in the air between the stacks of bananas. The neighborhood gossip mill was efficient. She undoubtedly knew William had moved out. She was probably fishing, her curiosity warring with her manners. "And, how's William?" she finally asked, the question clumsy and transparent. I didn't stiffen. I didn't feel the hot rush of shame or anger. I looked at her and I felt a wave of pity. Pity for her need to know, for her entrapment in the small dramas of suburbia that I had somehow, miraculously, graduated from. "I wouldn't know," I said calmly, placing a perfectly ripe avocado in my basket. "We're divorced." The bald statement, delivered without a hint of tremor, seemed to startle her. She blinked. Oh, Charlotte, I'm so sorry." "Don't be," I said, and I offered her a small, genuine smile. It wasn't a smile of happiness about the divorce, but a smile of serenity about my own place in its aftermath. It was for the best. Really, I could see her recalibrating, trying to fit my calm demeanor into her expected narrative of the devastated, pitiable divorcee. It didn't fit. I was an outlier. "Well," she said, flustered, "you look great, really great, really great. Thank you," I said. "It was good to see you, Sarah. Give my best to Bill." I pushed my cart past her, heading for the leafy greens. My heart was beating normally. My hands weren't shaking. I felt no urge to cry, no residual anger. The encounter was over and it had left no mark. I had stated my truth without apology or elaboration, and I had survived it. More than survived, I had remained utterly, completely myself. the armor of my new life had held. The final confirmation came that evening at the pool. It was the last class of the session. Janice had us doing a timed swim, a test of our endurance. The goal was 20 laps of the crawl. Continuous. I stood at the edge, my toes curling over the rough concrete. The water looked different tonight. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was an invitation. Janice blew the whistle. I plunged in. The water was its usual shock of cool, but it was a familiar embrace now. I found my rhythm immediately. Pull, breathe, kick, exhale. The world narrowed to the blue-black line on the bottom of the pool, the flash of the ceiling lights overhead with each turn of my head, the sound of my own breath, loud and steady in the internal silence of the swim. I didn't count the laps. I swam. My body knew what to do. The strength was there, in my shoulders, my core, my legs. The endurance was there, in my lungs. But the real change was in my mind. There was no struggle, no internal narration, no fight. There was just movement. There was just being. I was a body moving through water, powerful, efficient, and utterly at peace. I reached the wall and touched it, breathing hard. I looked up, pushing my goggles onto my forehead. Janice was standing there, stopwatch in hand, a wide grin on her face. 20 laps, Charlotte. And a personal best time. I hauled myself out of the water, my muscles singing with a pleasant, spent ache. I was dripping, breathing heavily, but I felt magnificent. Gary was clapping me on the back. "Nice job," he said, his own face flushed with effort. Janice handed me a towel. "Look at you," she said, her voice thick with a pride that made my throat tighten. "When you first got here, you couldn't put your face in the water. Now you're a swimmer." The word landed deep inside me. A swimmer. It wasn't just something I did. It was something I was. An identity, earned through fear and failure and relentless, dogged practice. I drove home that night, the car windows down, the cool air swirling around me. I didn't feel the need for music. The hum of the engine and the rush of the wind were enough. I felt a profound sense of wholeness. The broken pieces of me had not been glued back together into the old shape. They had been melted down in the relentless heat of grief and recast into something new, something stronger, something with a higher tolerance for pain and a greater capacity for joy. The transformation was complete. I was not the woman I had been before the party, nor was I the shattered creature on the kitchen floor. I was Charlotte, a 38-year-old divorcee, a loan officer, a competent cook, a woman who could look her past in the eye without flinching, a swimmer. I was whole. And I was, finally, unmistakably, my own. Contentment, I discovered, was not a destination one arrived at with a triumphant fanfare. It was not the grand, sweeping happiness of movies or the fervent, life-altering joy the self-help books promised. It was quieter. It was subtler. Why, it was the soil in which a new life grew, not the spectacular bloom itself. After the storm of grief and the arduous labor of transformation, contentment was the calm, clear weather that followed. It was the ability to breathe deeply without the constriction of pain, to move through the world without the weight of a broken heart. It was the profound, often mundane, satisfaction of a life that was wholly, unapologetically my own. This new phase announced itself in 1,000 small, unremarkable ways. It was in the pleasure of a Saturday morning with no agenda. No arguments over whose turn it was to do the groceries, no negotiations about which family function to attend, no need to compromise on what to have for breakfast. I could make a pot of strong coffee and drink the entire thing myself, reading a book in the living room until the afternoon light slanted through the windows. The solitude was no longer a sentence, it was a luxury. It was in the financial autonomy that had once been so terrifying. Signing the final divorce papers had been a somber affair, a last legal whisper of the life we'd shared. But with it came a clean severance. My accounts were mine. My debts were mine. My decisions were mine. I paid my mortgage on time. I bought a new set of high thread count sheets simply because I liked the color, a deep oceanic blue that William would have deemed impractical. The act was a tiny declaration of independence, a selfish, wonderful luxury. The house was fully, completely my sanctuary now. I had, on a whim, painted the bedroom a soft, warm gray. I'd rearranged the furniture into a configuration that was less about couples and more about light and flow and my own personal comfort. His side of the closet was now a spacious home for my off-season clothes and a newly acquired sewing machine, a contraption I was teaching myself to use with a combination of YouTube tutorials and stubborn determination. The ghost had been thoroughly exorcised by the paint fumes and the pragmatic reorganization of space. My social life, once a barren landscape, began to slowly, organically regenerate. It wasn't about finding a new partner or a new crowd. It was about reconnecting with myself as a social being, outside the context of a couple. I had lunch with a few women from work. Conversations that were refreshingly free of the shared history that had once defined all my interactions. We talked about books, about a new restaurant, about the absurdities of corporate life. It was light, it was easy, and it was enough. I even went out for drinks with Janice, my swim instructor, after our final class. We sat at a quiet bar and she told me about her own divorce, 20 years prior. "It feels like the end of the world," she said, sipping her gin and tonic. And then one day, you realize it was just the end of a world. And that there are other, better worlds to build. Her words resonated deeply. I was building my world. Brick by quiet brick. The most significant test of this newfound contentment came with the holidays. Thanksgiving loomed, a holiday that had always been a sprawling, chaotic affair with William's large, loud family. The thought of spending it alone in my quiet house had once filled me with a special kind of dread. But as the day approached, the feeling wasn't dread, but possibility. I decided to do Thanksgiving my way. I didn't cook a massive turkey. I made a small, herb-roasted chicken. I made mashed potatoes for one, with a sinful amount of butter. I roasted Brussels sprouts with bacon, a dish William had hated. I set the table for one, with my nice china and a single, beautiful taper candle. I opened a bottle of expensive wine I'd been saving for a special occasion and decided that my own company was occasion enough. I ate slowly, savoring every bite. There was no noise except for the soft jazz playing in the background. There was no stress, no cleanup for a crowd. After dinner, I bundled up and took a long walk through the quiet, empty streets of my neighborhood, other people's laughter and the smells of their feasts occasionally drifting from their houses. I didn't feel a pang of loneliness. I felt a sense of peaceful observation. I was a part of the world, yet happily separate from it. That night, as I washed my single plate and glass, I felt a wave of contentment so profound it was almost dizzying. It was the simple, unadulterated joy of autonomy. I had faced down a holiday designed for togetherness and had not just survived it, but had curated an experience that was perfectly, uniquely satisfying for me. I had given myself the gift of a peaceful day, and the act of giving it to myself made it more valuable than any party I'd ever attended. This sense of peaceful self-sufficiency began to color everything. Work became less of a grind and more of an engaging puzzle. I was good at my job, and I took a new pride in it, in the clean logic of numbers and risk assessment. I started a small, secret project, researching the possibility of refinancing my mortgage on my own terms, a complex financial dance I was learning the steps to, just for me. I didn't need a man. I didn't need a relationship to feel complete. The longing for one, the desperate need to fill the void with another person, had vanished. It had been replaced by a deep, resonant sense of being enough. If someone were to come along, it would have to be an addition to my already full life, not a foundation for a new one. The pressure was off. I was no longer looking. My happiness was no longer an external object to be found. It was an internal state to be cultivated. One December weekend, on a whim, I drove to the coast. It was a 3-hour drive, something I would have once deemed too far to go alone. I booked a single night in a quaint off-season bed and breakfast that overlooked the gray, churning winter Atlantic. I walked on the cold, empty beach for hours, the wind whipping my hair, the roar of the ocean, the only sound. I ate dinner at a dockside restaurant, sitting at the bar, content to watch the fishermen unload their catch. I felt small against the vastness of the sea, but not insignificant. I felt connected to something ancient and powerful, a part of the great, swirling tapestry of life. Sitting in my room that night, looking out at the dark water, I realized this was it. This was the happiness I'd been working toward. It wasn't a constant state of euphoria. It was this: the ability to be alone with myself in a strange place and feel perfectly at home. The peace that came from knowing I could rely on myself, that my own company was not just tolerable, but enjoyable. The quiet confidence that I could handle whatever came next, not because I was fearless, but because I had already handled so much. Contentment was the space between the notes. It was the deep, satisfying silence after the music of my old life had ended, a silence I had learned to fill with my own rhythm. I was happy, not because my life was perfect, but because it was mine. Entirely, completely, unequivocally mine. And that, I had come to understand, was the greatest victory of all. The contentment I had cultivated was not a fortress. It did not have high walls designed to keep the world out. It was more like a well-tended garden, a private, peaceful space I had built for myself, but one that existed within the wider world. I was no longer looking for someone to come in and till the soil or plant new seeds. I was perfectly happy tending it myself. But that didn't mean I was opposed to a visitor, should one happen to wander by with respect and a genuine appreciation for the landscape. The difference was profound. I was no longer desperate for a gardener. I was content in my own company, and any addition would be a welcome guest, not a necessary salvation. The meet-cute, when it happened, was so devoid of cliché and so perfectly mundanely real that I almost didn't recognize it for what it was. It was not in a bar, or at a party, or through a well-meaning friend's setup. It was in a sterile, brightly lit waiting room at the veterinarian's office, and it smelled faintly of antiseptic and anxious dog. The patient was not mine. I had no pets. My patient was my friend and colleague, Lena, from work. Her ancient, beloved dachshund, Bruno, had developed a sudden limp, and Lena was stuck in a mandatory all-day training seminar that she couldn't escape. Panicked, she'd called me. "Charlotte, I know it's a huge ask, but could you possibly take him?" "I've already called. They can squeeze him in at 4030. I'll owe you forever. He's so little and he's scared of everyone, but he knows you." And so I found myself on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on a hard plastic chair with a trembling, warm bundle of blanket and dog on my lap. Bruno, who was mostly blind and deaf, quivered against my chest, his little nose twitching at the unfamiliar, alarming smells. I stroked his head, murmuring nonsense reassurances, feeling a surprising surge of protective tenderness for the little creature. The waiting room was a cross-section of quiet drama. A woman with a cat carrier from which emanated low, threatening growls. A man trying to calm a whining Labrador puppy that was determined to lick every surface in the room. And in the chair opposite me, a man with a rabbit. The rabbit was enormous, a placid, floppy-eared creature of a soft fawn color. It was nestled in a pet carrier on the man's lap, its nose twitching calmly. The man himself was perhaps in his early 40s, with kind eyes that looked tired behind his glasses, and the sort of rumpled, comfortable look of someone who spent more time with animals than with dry cleaners. He was gently stroking the rabbit's head through the carrier door with one finger, his movements slow and soothing. Our eyes met over the heads of our respective charges. He offered a small, commiserating smile, a silent acknowledgement of the shared absurdity and anxiety of the vet's waiting room. I returned it, a brief, polite connection between two strangers in a moment of small, domesticated crisis. The Labrador puppy finally succeeded in its mission to escape its owner and bounded over, its tail wagging with chaotic joy, its nose headed straight for Bruno in my lap. I instinctively pulled the dachshund closer, shielding him. "Buster, no, sorry, so sorry," the Labrador's owner called out, scrambling to grab the dog's collar. But before he could, the man with the rabbit had smoothly shifted his carrier to one side and put out a hand, not to grab the puppy, but to offer it a sniff. "Whoa there, big guy," he said, his voice calm and low. The puppy, distracted, investigated his hand instead. "Easy now. Not everyone wants to play," he looked up at me. "He's friendly, just a lot of energy." "It's okay," I said, my heart rate settling. "He's just enthusiastic." The man smiled again, a warmer one this time that reached his eyes. "Enthusiastic is a kind word for it." He nodded toward the quivering blanket in my lap. "Who have you got in there?" "A borrowed dachshund named Bruno." "He's fragile." "Ah," he said, understanding dawning on his face. "Doing a friend a solid." "That's nice of you," he gestured to his own carrier. "This is Noodle, my rabbit. He's here for a wellness check." not so fragile, but a notorious drama queen when it comes to car rides. Noodle, I repeated, a genuine laugh escaping me. That's a great name. He's a great rabbit, the man said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to declare. Thinks he's a dog, honestly. Follows me around the house, begs for carrot tops. The conversation was simple, silly, and entirely grounded in the present moment. There was no subtext, no pressure. We were just two people, waiting, making small talk to pass the time and ease the low-grade stress of the environment. It was easy. Charlotte, a vet tech, called from the doorway. That's us, I said, standing up carefully with Bruno. The man with the rabbit noodles owner gave a little wave. Good luck in there, Bruno. An hour later, Bruno had been diagnosed with a minor sprain, given pain medication, and was sleeping soundly in his blanket on the passenger seat of my car. I was settling the bill at the front desk when I heard a familiar, calm voice behind me. And, just make it for the same time next year, please. Thanks, Debbie, I turned. It was him, zipping up his coat, Noodles carrier in hand. All good? He asked, seeing me. All good. Just a sprain. How's Noodle? In perfect health, according to the doc. And deeply offended by the entire experience. He shifted the carrier. Well, I'm glad your friend's dog is okay. There was a slight pause. It wasn't awkward, but it was potential. He seemed to be considering something. I found myself hoping he would. The easy camaraderie had been a surprise, a tiny, bright spot in an ordinary day. Look, he said, rubbing the back of his neck with his free hand in a gesture that was both nervous and endearing. This is probably out of left field, and feel free to say no, but there's a really good coffee shop just around the corner. The kind that has those little animal cookies. I was going to get a cup to recover from the trauma. Would you, maybe, want to join me? You look like you could use a post-vet debrief. It wasn't a slick whine. It was a little clumsy, entirely situational, and utterly charming because of it. He wasn't hitting on me. He was asking if I wanted to get coffee after a shared, mildly stressful experience. The green flag wasn't a grand gesture. It was this simple, low-key invitation. I hesitated, but not out of fear or reluctance. I hesitated out of a moment of conscious choice. I looked inward, at my well-tended garden of contentment. Was there space for a visitor? The answer came immediately, and it was a calm, sure yes. This wasn't a threat to my peace. It was a potential extension of it. A post-vet debrief, I said, smiling. I think that's exactly what I need. But I have a sleeping dachshund in my car. We can sit outside, he said quickly. They have tables. He can sleep in his blanket. We'll keep an eye on him. And so, 10 minutes later, I was sitting at a small wrought iron table outside a cozy coffee shop, a steaming latte in front of me, Bruno snoozing in his carrier at my feet. Across from me was David. David, who was a woodworker. David, who had inherited Noodle from his younger sister when she went to college. David, who indeed cried at commercials with dogs in them and who could recite the entire script of The Princess Bride, but whose knowledge of 80s movies otherwise was, by his own admission, tragically limited. We talked about our jobs, his in his workshop, mine at the bank. We talked about the challenges of cooking for one. We talked about the best hiking trails in the state. He asked me about Bruno and I explained about Lena, which led to me mentioning, casually, that I was divorced. He nodded, no pity in his eyes, just understanding. Yeah, he said. Me too. 4 years now, it gets different. It was the perfect thing to say. It gets different. Not better, not worse, just different. He understood the topography. He told me a story about trying to build a blanket fort for his niece and nephew, and it collapsing spectacularly, and I laughed until my sides hurt. I told him about my disastrous first attempts at swimming, and he listened with genuine interest. There was no performance, no trying to impress. It was just two people, sharing snippets of their lives over coffee, seeing if the puzzle pieces might fit. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. Bruno woke up and whined softly. It was time to go. I should get him back to Lena, I said, feeling a genuine pang of reluctance. Of course, David said, standing up. I should go check on Noodle. Make sure he hasn't staged a protest in his hutch. We stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, the easy conversation momentarily pausing. I had a really nice time, Charlotte, he said, his hands in his pockets. Thanks for braving the post-vet debrief with me. I had a nice time too, David. Thanks for the coffee. Another pause. The potential moment hung between us. A card exchange? A request for a number? He solved it simply. This is my regular vet. And this, he nodded to the coffee shop, is my regular coffee place. I'm here most Tuesdays after work, actually, if you ever, find yourself with a borrowed dog again. Or just want a coffee. It was an invitation without pressure. An open door I could choose to walk through. Or not. It was perfect. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and I meant it. He smiled. A warm, crinkly-eyed smile. Good. Take care of yourself, Charlotte. And Bruno, he gave a little wave and turned to walk away. I drove home, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Bruno snored softly in the passenger seat. I felt a quiet, buzzing warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. It wasn't the dizzying high of infatuation. It was something quieter, steadier. It was the feeling of an interesting, unexpected door opening in a hallway I thought I knew well. I had not been looking for it. I had not needed it. But now that it was there, I was curious to see what was on the other side. The meet-cute hadn't been cute. It had been real. It had been messy, involving a limping dog and a dramatic rabbit. And that, I thought with a smile, was so much better. The happy ending was not a single framed photograph. It was a sprawling, chaotic, beautiful collage, a living album of moments both monumental and mundane, all glued together with the quiet, resilient adhesive of a joy that had been earned, not found. It was the culmination of 1,000 small choices, 1,000 trembling steps taken in the dark that had finally, miraculously, led into the sunlight. It did not arrive with the dramatic fanfare I might have once imagined. There was no sweeping romantic gesture that erased the past. Instead, it built itself around me day by day in the patient, steady way that David himself had entered my life. Our Tuesday coffee debriefs became a ritual, then an expectation, then the anchor of my week. We talked about everything and nothing. The conversation was easy, a river finding its natural course. He was exactly who he had seemed that first day, kind, steady, unassuming, and possessed of a dry, clever wit that continually surprised me. Our first official date was not to a fancy restaurant, but to a dog park. Weena had officially deputized me as Bruno's weekend walker, and David suggested we take him and let him socialize, which mostly involved Bruno sniffing imperiously at the other dogs from the safety of my feet, while David and I walked slow laps around the perimeter talking. It was perfect. The relationship unfolded at a pace that felt natural, unhurried. There was no frantic urgency, no desperate need to force a future. We were simply two whole people who had built their own lives and had discovered, to their delight, that they fit well together. He had his workshop, his rabbit, his quiet routines. I had my house, my swimming, my hard-won independence. We didn't merge, we overlapped, creating a new, shared territory that was richer for the strength of our individual foundations. He cried during a commercial for dog food. I found him one Saturday morning in my kitchen, attempting to make pancakes and failing spectacularly, batter dripping from the ceiling. He knew the names of constellations and would point them out to me on clear nights from my backyard, his hand warm in mine. His green flags weren't grand, they were a constant, gentle breeze. 2 years after that first coffee, he sold his small house and moved into mine. It wasn't a question of whose space to take, it was a mutual decision to make a new space, together, in the home I had fought so hard to make my own. His integration was not an invasion, but an enhancement. His woodworking tools found a home in the garage. Noodle's hutch took up a sunny corner of the backyard. His books mingled with mine on the shelves, and our debates over which mug to use in the morning became a beloved daily ritual. The house, once a symbol of loss, now hummed with a new, vibrant energy. It was fuller, louder, and infinitely warmer. The question of children was a conversation, not an assumption. We sat on the sofa one night, a blanket fort from a failed attempt with his niece and nephew still collapsed gloriously in the corner of the room, and we talked about it with an honesty I hadn't known was possible. "I think I'd like to try," I'd said, my voice quiet in the dim light. "The idea of a family, with you, it doesn't feel scary. It feels like a new adventure. David had squeezed my hand, his eyes serious. "I'd like that too. Whatever that looks like, the universe, perhaps in a gesture of kindness after the storm, offered us a straightforward path. A year later, after the thrilling, terrifying, and utterly mundane journey of pregnancy, I gave birth to twins. A boy and a girl. Benjamin and Eleanor. They were placed on my chest. Two squalling, perfect, red-faced miracles. And the love that washed over me was so vast and terrifying it dwarfed any emotion I had ever known. It was a love that had no past, only a limitless, overwhelming future. David stood beside me, tears streaming unabashedly down his face, his hand on my cheek, and in that moment, every broken piece of my past felt redeemed, not because it had led me here, but because it had made me the woman who was strong enough to be here. The happy ending was Benjamin's fierce, determined grip on my finger. It was Eleanor's first, gummy smile. It was the soul-crushing exhaustion of twin infants, mitigated by the sight of David walking slow circles in the living room at 3 a.m., humming a off-key lullaby to a baby nestled in each arm. It was the messy, glorious, chaotic symphony of our new life. The house was too small. It was a wonderful, practical, chaotic problem to have. With 2 babies, a rabbit, and the ever-present shadow of a pampered dachshund who visited frequently, our cozy home felt like it was bursting at the seams. We needed space, a yard for the children to run in, a room for David's workshop that wasn't the garage. A fresh start for all of us. We sold the Pennsylvania house, the place that held the ghosts of my old life and the foundations of my new one. It was a closing of a circle, but not with a lock and key. It was with a grateful farewell. We packed up our lives, our memories, our growing family, and we moved. Not to a different state, but to the countryside of Pennsylvania, to an old, sprawling farmhouse on a few acres of land. It needed work. It had character. It had space. It had a porch swing and a big oak tree just waiting for a treehouse. The happy ending is this. It is a Saturday morning. The sunlight streams into the kitchen of the farmhouse, which is, as always, in a state of beautiful disarray. Breakfast dishes are piled in the sink. Benjamin's toy trucks are scattered across the floor. Eleanor is in her high chair, meticulously smearing yogurt in her hair while babbling happily to a patient noodle who is safely contained in his designated corner of the room. David is at the stove, attempting pancakes again. He is, predictably, failing. A dollop of batter lands on the floor. He swears good-naturedly under his breath. I am standing at the counter, packing a diaper bag for our outing. We are going to a flea market. It is our favorite weekend activity, a treasure hunt for cast-offs and curiosities. Benjamin is at my feet, trying to help by putting a wooden block into the bag. "No, sweetie, that stays here," I say, laughing, extracting the block. He looks up at me with his father's eyes and grins, a mischievous, heart-melting smile. I look around. At the mess. At the man I love, making a mess. At the children we made, making messes. At the rabbit, serenely observing the chaos he reigns over. The noise is immense. Babbling, clattering, the sizzle of the pan, David's off-key humming. It is the absolute opposite of the silence that once threatened to consume me. This is the happy ending. It is not a perfect, still photograph. It is a moving, breathing, gloriously imperfect picture. It is the contentment I built for myself, now shared, amplified, and reflected back at me in the eyes of my family. The woman who sat on the kitchen floor, shattered by a broken mug and a broken heart, is still here. But she is now also this, a mother. A partner, a swimmer who still goes to the community pool every week. A woman who survived. The scars of the past are still there. They are a part of my topography, but they are no longer wounds. They are reminders of the strength it took to heal. William is a distant memory, a character from a book I read long ago. The pain is gone, faded into the background hum of a life that is too full, too present, too vibrant to dwell in the past. David brings me a cup of coffee, kissing my temple. "Ready for adventure?" he asks. I look out the window at the green fields surrounding our new home, at the old oak tree, at the endless possibility. I look at the messy, beautiful life we have built together, on the solid foundation I built for myself. Yes, I say, and I mean it with every fiber of my being. I am ready. The happy ending isn't an ending at all. It is a continuous, unfolding beginning. And it is mine.